Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself. I'll go first. While preparing to film the movie Titanic, James Cameron took so many dives to the bottom of the ocean to the site of the wreckage that when it was all said and done, he had spent more time on the Titanic than the actual passengers did before the ship sank. Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself. I'll go first.
Oh, don't worry, boo-boo. I got one that will blow your mind. Because did you know under the Freedom of Information Act, you can legally request your file from the FBI? You think I'm kidding? There's an entire WikiHow page on how to request your file. Oh, and you can request any and all information the FBI has gathered on you from the day of your birth to this very moment. This is the literal request form you're looking at. And I've come to the realization that I've gotten too much attention as I'm in a couple of articles online. And I even pop up for Artizu and Sharpie Challenge. I really want to fill out this form and see what kind of lists I'm on, but there is one catch. On the request form, it says I am willing to pay up to blank dollars for the processing of this request. So you have to grease some palms to get your files.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
They don't take your kidney out when you get a transplant. They put the new one on top of the old one.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
They don't take your kidney out when you get a transplant. They put the new one on top of the old one.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
This one is gonna break some Southern hearts, and I am so sorry to do this to y'all, but you need to know. This household favorite, Southern Comfort Sweet Tea, has a dark side that you need to know about. The plant that produces the tea leaves for white, green, black, and oolong teas absorb fluoride from the soil and deposit the majority of it in its leaves. Older and more mature leaves contain up to 20 times more fluoride than the younger tea leaves. As you can see, green tea has a high level of fluoride content along with black tea. Oolong tea has a medium to high level, while white tea is low and herbal tea has none. Herbal tea covers a wide range of any sort of flowers, roots, and herbs. Rooibos or red bush tea is a great alternative to black tea, and it's native to South Africa. This is good to consider switching out for your sweet tea. Roasted dandelion root, but also any other parts of the dandelion plant are a great tea alternative, also for coffee as well. Hibiscus tea, one of my absolute favorites, definitely has a berry cranberry-like flavor. Stay away from tea bags. They are bleached and filled with known carcinogens and are toxic for the body. A good alternative to tea bags would be buying something like this online, which are reusable and better for the planet. Usually if it's better for the planet, it's better for us.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Female tears lower testosterone in men who smell them. This experiment was done at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. Even if they dripped saline water down a female's cheek, there was no testosterone lowering effect. But even if the tears were in a petri dish, any male who smelled them had an instant drop in both arousal and testosterone level. Chemical warfare. So literally, if you make a woman cry, it makes you less of a man. I mean, physically.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
I've known about this fact for a while, but it always gets people when I tell them about it. The only reason people who take pill contraceptive have a placebo pill in their birth control pack is because the Catholic Church wanted it there. Go ahead. If you don't believe me, stitch this and look it up for yourself. It's true. When birth control was becoming prominent, the Pope didn't like the fact that birth control didn't have a woman bleed naturally. Any OB will tell you that a continuous cycle of hormones is much more healthy for you than stopping and having breakthrough bleeding. Now, obviously, this depends on the birth control. I'm not saying that you shouldn't take your placebo pill, but my OB basically told me that if I don't want to, I don't have to have a period. Thank Jesus for your pain. Hail Satan, everybody.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
In 1726, a pregnant woman named Mary Toff was working in a field. She was minding her own business when she was suddenly startled by a rabbit. For the rest of her pregnancy, she said she had an insatiable craving for rabbit meat. And when the time came for her to give birth, they summoned a doctor. Dr. John Howard arrived on the scene and helped Mary Toff give birth. Here's where it gets weird. Instead of giving birth to a healthy human baby, Mary Toff delivered a bunch of dead animal parts, including a litter of baby bunnies. Obviously, this baffled the poor doctor. And over the next month or so, poor Dr. Howard was called back to Mary Toff to deliver more dead rabbits. Word of this strange phenomenon made it all the way to King George, who sent not one, but 2 other physicians to check into this story about Mary Toff giving birth to rabbits. The first surgeon saw it and thought there was some kind of supernatural phenomena happening. But the second surgeon got there and smelled a rat. So he packed Mary up to London and held her under observation, waiting for her to birth more rabbits. Obviously, while she was under watch, the rabbit births stopped. But they did catch a porter hired by Mary's sister-in-law trying to sneak dead rabbit parts into Mary's accommodations. Eventually, after being threatened with a living autopsy, Mary came clean. Essentially, she did it to become a bit of an oddity and become what was effectively an 18th century freak show act. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because it is widely believed the story of Mary Toft giving birth to rabbits is the inspiration for the age-old magic trick, pulling a rabbit out of a hat.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
The reason why bananas taste different to banana flavored things is that banana flavored products are flavored from a strain of bananas that went extinct in the 1950s. They were completely wiped out by some kind of disease, but the fruit industry kept that flavor on file, and that is what they use to flavor banana flavored products.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
So I've been doing a lot of videos on why the United States is not the greatest country in the world and is essentially becoming an underdeveloped country. And in my findings, I found that the United States has produced 67.5% of all known serial killers. Let me reiterate that. Notice I did not say North America. I said the United States. We have produced almost 70% of known serial killers, which means the other 33% comes from the other 195 countries in the world. We have 3 times more serial killers per capita than the next country, which is England. Alaska produces the most serial killers, followed by Florida. Surprise, surprise. Yes, you are right, Texas is on that list too. But then again, so is California. So that's why I always find it comical when people ask me, do you feel safe solo traveling in other countries? My dude, I am out here surviving with serial killers running rampant.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
The 1986 film The Troll had 2 characters named Harry Potter and had characters such as witches, wizards, trolls, and other mythical creatures.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
So Michael Jackson, the king of pop, Michael Jackson, was a big fan of Spider-Man. And he wanted to make a Spider-Man movie. Not only did he want to make the movie, he wanted to play Spider-Man. So Michael Jackson wanted to play the role of Peter Parker in his Spider-Man film. He was so serious about this, he actually approached Stan Lee about acquiring the rights for Spider-Man to be able to make this movie. I guess Stan Lee explained to him that he couldn't give him authority to do that he would actually have to obtain the rights from Marvel. So the story goes that Michael Jackson actually attempted to buy Marvel. I'm not sure if he actually ended up approaching Marvel and attempting to purchase, but he definitely considered it. Oh, and a bonus on Michael Jackson and Marvel. Michael Jackson auditioned for the part of Professor X in X-Men.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
that the danger of eating raw cookie dough or raw cake batter is not from the raw egg, but from the raw flour. It's now possible to remove all the contaminants, such as bird droppings, from the grain before processing into flour, so sometimes you get some bird poop mixed in.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself. I'll go first.
Okay, so I had no idea that this was even a thing until recently. I did not believe it was true, and then I looked it up and was shook. So recently I was told that apparently all pigeon poo in the United Kingdom is owned by the Crown. I looked it up and it's true. All pigeon poo in the United Kingdom is owned by the Crown. The Queen owns like a ton of pigeon poo. And apparently the reason for this is that back in the 18th century, George I basically made this a law. He decreed that he owns all of the pigeon poo in the United Kingdom. And apparently the main reason that King George I made this law is because pigeon poo is a component of gunpowder. So like, was it kind of like a threat or something to like show power? I don't know. Weird.
Stitch with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe until you looked it up yourself.
The Dave Matthews Band Chicago poop bus incident. So like 20-ish years ago, the Dave Matthews Band was traveling through Chicago and they had their tour bus, right? And they were like, we have to dump all of this poop. Where are we going to dump it? So they go to the Chicago Bridge in like River North. And you know how Chicago bridges, like they're like this and then they open up to like let boats through. Well, Dave Matthews Band was like, okay, let's just dump our poop and maybe like it'll get washed away like in the river. I don't know what they were thinking, but it was like a lot of poop. It was like 800 pounds of poop, right? And they dump all of this poop out of their tour bus. But there's a boat tour going on underneath them. I think it's like a newlywed couple, like a little kid and like loads of like family members. They got 800 pounds of poop dumped on them. They were like throwing up and sick. And And the mayor at the time made a statement saying how dumping poop was absolutely unacceptable, but Dave Matthews was still a good band. These people were traumatized. Poop on their heads. There was a baby there.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
The fact that 13 people a year die from vending machines falling on them. Not that that's funny, but it kind of like, it's just so ridiculous.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
In the great state of Illinois, if you are 50 years old or older, you can marry your first cousin. Yeah. Why did this law need to be established?
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
So here's one for you. The Rock is a 5-time WWE Tag Team Champion, and none of his reigns lasted longer than 8 days.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Yankee Candle reviews are indicative of COVID surges. Before the two most recent increases in COVID cases, the number of one-star reviews for Yankee Candles have also increased. Why would that be the case, you might be wondering? Well, most of the one-star reviews say things like, this candle has no smell. Or, I've bought this candle multiple times and it always smells amazing, but now they must have changed the formula because it doesn't smell like anything. The candles haven't changed at all. What's changed is people's ability to smell when they have COVID.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
The time between The Lion King being released in theaters and now is greater than the time between the moon landing and The Lion King being released. Now, obviously, I know the moon landing happened in 1969 and Lion King came out in the 90s, but I wasn't sure which year, so I had to Google it. And it's 94. And that means 25 years between the moon and Lion King, and we're sitting at 28 years since The Lion King. Fuck, that's like the fact about Cleopatra and the pyramids. Oh, fuck.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Kangaroos have 5 legs. Google it.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
I love these because I have so many of them. The CIA created a special weapon that would give people a heart attack without them even knowing it. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it came out in 1975. After Watergate, a whole bunch of nasty stuff came out that the CIA had been doing. And one of those things was that they had converted a weapon to shoot darts, poison darts that would be like made out of ice, so they would dissolve in the body. The person wouldn't even know they got shot. It had shellfish toxins, say that 10 times fast, and the person would get a heart attack. And it wouldn't even be able to be like, no one would know after the fact why they had a heart attack. And that's a thing that came out. Also look up MKUltra and COINTELPRO. Those are things that came out all in the church committee hearings. There was a Senate Select Committee, 1975. Look that up. It's crazy. It sounds fake, but it's real.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
That pencils never contained lead. Now, the paint on the pencil, the yellow part, might have had lead, but the lead inside a pencil has always been graphite. It was never actually lead.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
You are 3 times more likely to encounter a virus or malware on your computer from a religious site than you are an adult site. This is done from research by Symantec, the antivirus software company, and this is the second strangest fact that I have learned in the past 24 hours. If you want to know the first one, drop it in the comments below because it's truly weird.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
There was a short period of time where the 6th largest navy in the world was Pepsi Cola. I'm serious. So, the Soviet Union loved Pepsi, and they wanted Pepsi. So they figured out a way to trade Pepsi for the one thing that the Soviet Union had, vodka. Well, in the 80s, Reagan, Cold War, people stopped buying vodka and anything made in Russia. The ruble was worth nothing, and so they figured out Gorbachev had a whole bunch of surplus military equipment, so he gave it to Pepsi. A whole bunch of subs, they barely floated. They were rusty, they were nasty, and ended up that Pepsi just sold them to somewhere in Scandinavia for scrap. But for that time, for that small amount of time that they had those ships, Pepsi had the 6th largest navy in the world.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
So fetuses in the womb at about 20 weeks will start to grow hair all over their body. It's called lanugo, and the purpose is to keep the fetus warm in the womb while it's still growing. That's why you'll often see babies born prematurely covered in like a weird felty hair all over their body. That's like their lanugo. However, if a baby isn't premature and it's carried to term, it's not covered in lanugo because in utero, the fetus sheds that hair and then eats it. That's right, it sheds an entire fetus's worth of hair and then eats it. Hair. The baby eats hair. Look it up.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
This is my favorite fact. There are 52 cards in a standard deck of playing cards, meaning that the amount of different configurations of those cards is 52 factorial, which is 52 times 51 times 50 times 49 and so on and so forth, which comes out to a number that is larger than the amount of atoms in the universe, which means that if you properly shuffle a deck of cards, there's a good chance that order of cards is the only time cards have ever been in that order in recorded time.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself. I'll go first.
Back in the day, when homeowners would finally pay off their home loan, they'd host a big party with all their friends and burn their mortgage documents. This became known as the housewarming party.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Ridley Scott intentionally toned down the historical accuracy in the movie Gladiator because he was afraid that if audiences saw things like gladiators being paid spokespeople and Romans having billboards for products, he was afraid that the audiences wouldn't believe it. They would think it was too modern. This is something that Joe Walton called the Tiffany problem, and it's when things in history that are real clash with our perception of the past. And it's named after the fact that Tiffany sounds like a modern name, but in fact dates to about the 12th century.
Stitch this with a fact so ridiculous you didn't believe it until you looked it up yourself.
Ooh, I got a good one for this. So, in London, I believe, there's a road called Grape Lane. And there are some other roads with like similar names to that. But these roads were not always called Grape Lane or something else innocuous. They used to be called Grope Seaward Lane in the Middle Ages. And yes, if you were wondering, they are where the prostitutes used to hang out.